So, good morning, everyone. This morning, I want to talk about suffering in the form of hard to face things, things which we find have trouble facing. And, we talk about suffering here often, if not every week, and because it is really one of the central teachings of Buddhism, but in the form of uh, lessening our suffering. And this First Noble Truth about suffering doesn't deny the joy, the beauty, peace that life can offer. It just says that suffering is an inevitable part of the picture, and we need to make our peace with it. And that First Noble Truth points to the underlying reality that suffering is an inevitable part of the human experience. And I think this hard to face idea is not only accurate, but really resonant with how we engage with pain, with loss, with dissatisfaction. Buddhism offers lots of practical wisdom for transforming our relationship to suffering, which help us face it with greater courage, with greater clarity, and with greater compassion. But why is it hard to face? Well, it's hard to face because, for one thing, it challenges our worldview, it challenges our sense of self, it challenges our illusions of permanence, of control, of pleasure. Somehow we think we shouldn't have it. It's not fair. Why is the universe doing it to me? We go on and on with stories about that make it hard for us to face our suffering. And we just naturally, from an evolutionary perspective, gravitate toward comfort and security. I mean, that's where we really want to be. But life doesn't always go along with that and presents us with pain, challenges, whether illness, aging, loss, unmet desires. Any and all of that can feel like an affront to our expectations, to our wishes, to our attachments. So the suffering really forces us to confront truths that we would rather avoid. Now, we can certainly try to put our heads in the sand, but it's not going to work. I mean, it's still going to catch up to us. Everything is impermanent. We talk about this all the time. We lack a fixed or enduring self, and the clinging to things, people, ideas leads to dissatisfaction and suffering. Those were the three marks of existence that the Buddha said are just part of the deal: impermanence, not self, and suffering. And suffering is, as you know, and we always talk about, is not just physical pain or external hardship. It's not just things that hit us from outside. And it includes, probably more prominently and more commonly, subtle forms of discontent, of restlessness, of anxiety, of boredom, this sort of vague sense of being unfulfilled. And these forms are more subtle, they're harder to pinpoint, and therefore sometimes harder to face, because they seem to arise from within without an obvious cause. And yes, they do arise from within, but usually with a cause we're just not aware of. And they expose the reality that so much of our suffering stems not from external circumstances, but from our own mental habits, our cravings. I want this, I want that, our aversions, I don't want this, I don't want that, and our ignorance or delusions, what the Buddha called the three poisons. And we know just from everyday experience that our default response to suffering is avoidance. We don't want to feel it because it's difficult to face. Our instinctive response is to avoid it, deny it, distract ourselves from it, push it away, on and on. And of course, this avoidance takes many forms. It can become trying to distract ourselves by getting busy or getting on our phones. Numbing ourselves with substances, just relationships, drama, overindulgence in things, clinging to false hopes, clinging to fantasies that give us some escape, momentarily escape. And yes, these strategies provide temporary relief, but in the long run, they deepen our suffering because they prevent us from addressing the root causes. The root causes, which we know are, ignoring impermanence, wanting things to be different than they are. When we seek and obtain temporary relief from suffering, we're just kicking the can down the road. Sooner or later, it's going to catch up with us. And avoidance simply keeps us trapped in this cycle of craving, trapped in this cycle of aversion, and perpetuates the very dissatisfaction we seek to escape. So we think avoidance works, but it just keeps us on that wheel of samsara. It just keeps us chasing our own tails. The Buddha, in his brilliance, urges us to take an entirely different approach. Instead of running away from suffering, he encourages us, somewhat paradoxically, to turn toward it with wisdom, turn toward it with mindfulness, to face it, but not in a way that results in us wallowing in despair or giving up or throwing in the towel or resigning, but in a way that really represents an act of courage. A willingness to look deeply into the nature of our pain and its causes. And by doing this, it is the first step in making suffering more manageable and even transformative. Because when we approach it with the right understanding and tools, we're engaging with it in a way that can begin to change our relationship with it. By leaning into our suffering rather than avoiding it. Facing suffering begins, first of all, with noticing, and I don't mean just the subjective feeling, but I mean being fully present with whatever is coming up without judgment or resistance. Usually when it arises, we want to hurry up and do something so we don't have to sit with it. But the Buddha asks us to sit with it, to be fully present with whatever's coming up, to bring into present moment awareness a space where we can observe it objectively and not become overwhelmed by it. For example, instead of identifying with thoughts like, I'm miserable, I'm a miserable person, what's wrong with me, our mindfulness helps us see it as a passing and temporary mental state. So instead of saying, I am miserable, we might say, oh, a miserable thought is arising. That's an interesting thought. Let me explore it. This subtle shift helps us disentangle ourselves from the intensity of it. It helps us avoid that immediate attempt to push it away, to get rid of it, to run from it. Because we see it and we know from the Buddha's wisdom that it is impermanent, ever-changing, and it will pass. You know, the Buddha invited us to investigate our suffering through the lens of the Four Noble Truths, knowing that it arises from craving, knowing that it arises from attachment, knowing that it arises from our insatiable desire for things to be different than they are. Whether we crave pleasure or avoid discomfort or cling to a false sense of identity, these mental habits keep us bound to the cycle of dissatisfaction. And when we understand this, when we really internalize this insight, we begin to we begin to loosen the grip of the suffering on these patterns. We begin to cultivate an acceptance of life's permanence, impermanence, and unpredictability. Facing suffering, though, requires compassion, not judging, not a harsh, what's wrong with me, but, oh, I can bring some compassion to this. Oh, this is tough, but I'll get through it, both for my own suffering and your suffering. Because when we meet our pain and suffering with kindness, rather than judgment, rather than resistance, it is less overwhelming. It is more manageable. Instead of asking, why me? Oh, why is this happening to poor me? We gently acknowledge, yes, this is hard. I don't like it, but it is simply part of being human. It is just part of the journey. That kind of compassion helps us soften our hearts and recognize that suffering is a universal experience. Nobody escapes it. None of us are alone with it. This realization fosters connection. It reduces our isolation that accompanies pain. And there's nothing like sharing pain and knowing that we're all in it together that helps take the edge off of it. One of the profound insights of Buddhism, I believe, is that facing our suffering, while difficult, is ultimately liberating. There is freedom in it. When we stop running from our pain and allow ourselves to experience it fully, we discover it's not this solid, impenetrable thing. It's not this permanent thing. It is something that is temporary for the most part. Suffering arises and passes away like all phenomenon. Even chronic pain arises and passes. It goes in waves. It's not constant. That's the whole premise behind mindfulness-based stress reduction. meeting our suffering, watching it come and go. By observing this process with mindfulness, we begin to see through the illusion of permanence. We develop a sense of freedom that is not dependent on outside circumstances. This is happening inside of us. And as a result, reducing our suffering by facing it opens the door to greater peace and joy. It creates space for that because we let go of our resistance. The resistance to suffering consumes so much mental energy, so much focus, so much time. And when we stop resisting life's inevitable difficulties, we create space for gratitude, contentment, and compassion to arise. We stop fighting battles with our suffering that we cannot win. We're not going to win. And this is what the Buddha meant by the cessation of suffering. It's not the complete absence of pain, but is the end of our habitual reactivity to it. Let me repeat that because that's sort of the takeaway for today. The cessation of suffering that the Buddha talked about is not the complete absence of pain. That's not going to happen. But it is the end of our habitual reactivity to it. In this state, we engage with life fully, embracing both its joys and its sorrows with equanimity. Joys and sorrows. So to say the title of today is to say that suffering is hard to face is to acknowledge a universal truth about our human condition. Yes, it's hard to face. We don't like it. We don't want to do it. But what are our choices? It is precisely by facing our suffering that we begin to transcend it. The path is not easy. It requires courage. It requires persistence, but it is deeply transformative. And I think most of us have seen that in our lives as we've walked this path. It does require tremendous commitment and courage. But through the tools of the Dharma, we learn to meet suffering with courage and understanding. We discover that within us are the seeds of liberation and peace. In this way, what is hard to face becomes not a source of despair, but an opportunity every time it shows up for growth and awakening. So those are some thoughts this morning on why things are hard to face.